Our health system could turn around overnight if people realized that babies didn't need to be born in the hospital.
There has been no improvement for all the money that is spent. In fact, the more money that has been sent in the system, the worse outcomes there
So
are.
many doctors have never even seen a natural. Oxytocin flows when you're having sex, and it should be flowing when you're giving birth. It's meant to be a pleasurable experience. The body knows how to take an egg and a sperm and grow it into a human being. Why wouldn't it know how to get that human being out? And the fact is, it does. We just have to get out of its way. There is a reflex that will propel that baby from your body if you aren't inhibiting it. It's the same reflex that sort of propels sperm. It'll shoot it from your body. But here again, stress, because I did not have prenatal care, or as some of us call it, prenatal scare. I mean, we're really taught from the very beginning to just turn ourselves over to the authorities. I think in a way, I had a little bit of a head start because my father was a doctor, and I grew up in that whole medical system, and it never felt right to me.
I think a lot of people have realized is that, do they really want to enter the medical system that was already so hostile to them about their freedom of choice over the vaccine?
And Grantley Dickreed had really studied fight, flight, and understood how many of our problems in birth are caused by fear. And basically, we are shutting down birthing, where our fear is triggering stress, which is turning on stress hormones, which shuts down birth hormones. And so when we don't have those birth hormones flowing through our system, then babies get stuck and women have all kinds of problems. And so Grantley Dickreed felt that if we could eliminate the fear and women could trust their bodies, and that babies could be born very easily, and it could be a life-changing, ecstatic.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Health Alliance Australia's podcast. My name is Jeannie Rose Antwerther, and I will be your host today. Health Alliance Australia is a leading health advocacy organisation dedicated to honouring bodily autonomy and well-informed health choices. For those of you who have recently joined us, recapping some of our recent interviews, we've interviewed Robin Gersbeck, his journey on recovering from terminal cancer without chemo, Dr. Garrett Smith on detoxification and avoiding being poisoned by supplements and drugs, Matt Goddard on TRE, a method to remove trapped stress in the body, Pia Nock on circadian rhythm and light as the missing link for healing, Di Ellis for alternative healing for Lyme disease and chronic fatigue, and Dr. Karen Johnson on regenerative healing on the atomic level. We are really pleased with all the incredible guests that we have had, and also the feedback from our audience on these life-changing information that we've been able to provide to you. Please go to our channel and check out these other videos. And today our guest is also an exceptional woman, Laura Shanley, writer, activist, speaker, author of the book Unassisted Childbirth, mother of four, with all children born at home without doctors and midwives, and now a grandmother, I believe.
Yes.
And she has been an activist in this space for over 40 years. She wrote her book in 1994. I would actually say to Laura that you're actually a bit of a woman's activist in this very important space. And I would thank you very, very much for all the women who out there who have fought the system to birth the way that they wanted, for being a voice, because it's not easy being this voice against the system here. I think people appreciate what you have done so much more since COVID, when you had the anti-vaxxers being demonized. And this is very much how women who chose to birth on their own terms have experienced this kind of discrimination and hatred for who we are.
Yes. Yes, I agree. It isn't an easy path.
And you've stuck with it for all these years.
Yeah, I never doubted it.
So much hate.
Yeah.
You get so much hate online. when you look up your name and all of a sudden you've got these trolls that are just coming out from nowhere, attacking you personally for who you are. And all you've really advocated for is something that our great-grandmothers and, all the generations of women before have done. Give birth at home, on their own terms, naturally. Right. And it's the word I think the medical system is incredibly afraid of. Natural, the word.
Right.
and going back to that primal instinct. So I was going to ask you, what actually inspired you to enter into this birth space in the first place? I mean, this is 40 years ago, probably really at the time when, it was quite normal to, it was really starting out the medicalization of birth, in a big way.
Right. And I wasn't really that aware of what was happening in hospitals at that point. I knew that my mother had told me about my birth, and it wasn't that great of an experience. I think I was posterior maybe, and she had a difficult time with me. And she had told me about the episiotomy.
Oh,
And that was enough to I was horrified. I was like, I'm never having babies. And then one night when I was 18, I met my future husband and now former husband, David Shanley, and he had been studying birth trauma. He had become interested in the evolution of self-consciousness, and that got him into birth trauma and how if the first experience you have in life is traumatic, that can set the tone for future experiences. And so if we can have birth not be traumatic, then a lot of our psychological and physical problems will go away. And so he was really intrigued by that. And in his studies, he had come across Grantley Dickread's book, Childbirth Without Fear. And so he was reading that the night, I think he was reading it for the second time, the night that I met him. And he
wow.
started telling me about this. Here I am, an 18-year-old college student, and he was a student. He was 10 years older than I was, but he was finishing up. He'd gone back to school and he was in his senior year. And so he started telling me about this book, and Grantley Dickread, who was an early natural childbirth advocate, British, some people say the early natural childbirth advocate. And Grantley Dickread had really studied fight flight and understood how many of our problems in birth are caused by fear. And basically we are shutting down birthing, where our fear is triggering stress, which is turning on stress hormones, which shuts down birth hormones. And so when we don't have those birth hormones flowing through our system, then babies get stuck and women have all kinds of problems. And so Grantley Dickread felt that if we could eliminate the fear and women could trust their bodies, and that babies could be born very easily, and it could be a life-changing ecstatic experience. And this just really appeal. It just sounded so fascinating. Like, why should the thing that ensures the continuation of the race be the worst thing a woman ever goes through? What kind of sense does that make?
Yeah.
And so when I decided to read the book, and I read the book and really became fascinated with the fight flight response, and how Grantley Dickread explained, when your face turns white when you're afraid, it's because the blood and oxygen is going to the arms and legs to fight this supposed danger or run from it. And it's not going to your face when you're afraid. It's not going to your uterus. So the uterus of a frightened woman is white. It literally doesn't have the fuel it needs. And that's why we have these problems. And it just made so much sense. So that's probably the long answer to.
Wow, that's really amazing that men could piece together this from a mental perspective. I mean, for myself, I think birth was very intuitive, and I just intuitively knew never to get involved in that whole watching a traumatic birth. So I
Right,
never imprinted on me this idea that birth was going to, and I had this, I just believed that it should be good. Like, as you said, how could something, such a gift, so amazing, be painful and horrible and all of
right.
that?
We're told that sex feels good so that we'll have it and we'll have babies and continue the race. So then what sense does it make that then the end result of that should be horrific? And I think, so many people believe the myths, not only that childbirth is inherently painful, but that it's inherently dangerous. And so, that's something else I ended up studying in the years to come, and how that's another myth, that women and babies weren't dying left and right prior to hospitals. They were dying
Yeah.
if they were starving to death, but in healthy tribal cultures, they really were successfully giving birth. And And it's the same way today. If women in third world countries, if they have a stressful life, if they're starving, if they don't have access to clean water and food, yes, their births may be problematic, but that doesn't mean that birth itself is inherently dangerous and inherently painful. So I think, so that's kind of been my goal all these years, is really to help dispel the myths so that women can relax and trust their bodies and allow them to give birth. And why you eat something, it's digested, it comes out, you go to sleep at night, your body keeps working. There's obviously some intelligence there. Your body knows how to take an egg and a sperm and grow it into a human being. Why wouldn't it know how to get that human being out? And the fact is, it does. We just have to get out of its way. And so that's what my work is all about.
Yeah, and it is that mental space. It's very interesting nowadays how the medical system actually hijacks that whole process from very early on. Firstly, through the media, through what you're saying, the educational
Right,
system and the media programming women to believe that birth is both dangerous and painful. And when,
right.
look, I've had all my births, I've had 11 births, so all been painless births. And
Wow.
it's such a disbelief to people that this could be possible, that, that surely, or that I was made that way. In fact, most of my births were actually posterior as well. And I didn't even
Right,
know that till later on. And I was like, but I knew which position to put myself in. It was just
right.
an instinct to know.
Hmm.
So, and I've watched the medical system actually become much harsher, like more medicalized over the years, to the point now that women are actually afraid of birth. Like, that there really isn't even a choice now. If you want a natural birth, you need to go in the wild. It's
Yeah,
become, even the midwives I've noticed, like I gave birth originally 30 years ago, and they were very natural in the beginning and how their approach to birth was. But the education system has sort of indoctrinated them too into this idea where now you've also got a society that's moving away from all of that. So we've now got online censorship where the government's going to start putting misinformation and disinformation on all of us because we are
right,
now going to counter that narrative, but firstly by our own testimonies, but also by the evidence that can be presented. And I assume you're putting that's sort of in your book as well about how it is inherently these reasons why birth was considered dangerous or in the past, or
right,
on
right.
how to
Yeah.
have a healthy unassisted birth.
Right. That it really is a matter kind of learning to do nothing. It's like just trust it. Like, what do you need to do in order to go to sleep? Well, you need the room to be dark and quiet. There's certain things. Now, if you can't fall asleep, generally it's because maybe something's on your mind. And basically you're telling your body, okay, I'm in danger. There's some reason I need to stay awake to fight this danger. That anxiety is pumping out those stress hormones, keeping you awake. And the same thing is happening with birth. Your body knows exactly what to do and it will carry it out very quickly and easily, but you're pumping out those stress hormones and it's like you're telling your bodies now is not the time to give birth. And so I think when people believe most people don't even question this. They're like, yes,
Yeah.
birth is dangerous. We know that because women throughout history died and babies died. They haven't studied tribal cultures. They don't know that in a lot of tribal cultures, the babies are taken away from the mother right after birth. Sometimes they're given bread and whale blubber because there are superstitions surrounding colostrum. And obviously, and the women may be hemorrhaging because the babies aren't nursing right after birth.
Okay.
But people don't really think about this. They only are aware of maybe these cultures that did have these superstitions. They're not aware of the cultures that gave birth successfully, that were healthy, that an anthropologist, there's a book called Childbirth Wisdom from the World's Oldest Societies by Judith Goldsmith, and she studied over 500 tribal cultures. And she said that anthropologists that lived with tribes 100, 150 years ago could observe a tribe for years and never, a healthy tribe, and never see a death or a complication. And she said it wasn't also because, some people say, well, they had midwives. No, she said that maybe there was the mother there or the mother-in-law, and Westerners would come in and they'd see a woman there with the birthing woman and they'd think, oh, she's the midwife. Well, no, she was just another woman in the tribe that was helping. So it wasn't really, it was when women began to sort of lose touch with their instincts as our rational critical mind began to develop. That's when we began to sort of lose touch with our instincts, and then women sort of forgot how to give birth. Just, a cat knows to go off to the closet, go off by itself. Most animals will go off by themselves. If they do have other animals surrounding them, they're not sticking their fingers in there and checking dilation. They're trying to keep predators away. So, and not to put down midwives, I think, obviously they're a step in the right direction and away from more the medicalization of birth. But in these societies, they weren't there in the beginning. It was the woman and her instincts. And now that we've really gotten a better understanding, at least I feel like from what I've studied, that those instincts are still there. And now that we've developed our rational critical mind, it's not like we're going back in time and doing what people used to do. Now we have our rational critical mind that's highly developed, and we can start tapping back into our natural instincts that have been there all along. And using our intuitive mind and our rational critical mind, we can have great births. We don't have to,
we can move
we
forward.
don't have to, turn ourselves over to the authorities.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting, isn't it, that now we can also see the relationship with gut health and microbes imprinting, like your, previous husband was talking about trauma as one aspect of birth, which you can see how we've got a traumatized society. This is the first experience they have as a baby that's been imprinted on them is trauma.
Right.
And when you actually look at it from say a physical perspective, if we were to join what you're talking about, the rational mind and the intuitive, we intuitively know to stay in a safe place that's familiar to us, where I guess all the familiar environment where we've grown this baby, and then to give birth in that environment rather than go into an alternative environment. And we all know, like when you do travel or when you do go outside of your area, like your immune system or whatever is kind of, you're not as relaxed, whatever reasoning it
Right.
is. There is that potential to get sick. I mean, sickness as a detoxification mechanism or whatever, but you feel safe at home. And I think what you're talking about in terms of women going by themselves, and I've always given birth pretty much alone with my husband, is that it's just this, to get into that space alone, what's right for you. Now, if some women feel comfortable with their mother or a circle of women around them, then all power to them. But it's really about that familiarity, isn't it? About being safe, feeling safe, and then all the right hormones and all the right blood flow goes to those organs and everything just works. Whereas what the medical system then does is they put women under lights, on a table, and on their back. And then they've got all various things prodding at them. And then they say, oh, please give birth. Now, I would challenge any woman to even try and, if someone said, just poo now, defecate now, and to a group of strangers, and they would automatically freeze up. I think that even in that situation, when you go into an unfamiliar place, even your bowel movements are
Definitely
disrupted.
right.
So how can we not put the connection with giving birth, a very sacred process, in front of strangers, essentially? Because no matter how many times you might see that person, they're not family. They're not someone that's intimate to you.
Yeah. And your body just automatically contracts, it's like inviting a stranger into the bathroom with you, or into the bedroom with you to have sex. It's like, we're just going to watch you, we're not going to, even if they said, we're just going to watch you and we're not going to interfere, just the watching, that's why when people say, well, I want to have a midwife there just in case, first of all, she's watching you. And for some women, it can be comforting to have the midwife there. But the problem comes is that so many of these midwives have their long list of regulations and they're required to do certain things. So yeah, would it be great to have somebody that you loved and, or you trusted, maybe not, you hadn't developed a strong relationship with, but somebody you trusted just there, just in case. But a lot of midwives cannot do that. They can't just say, you know what do you want? Do you want me to leave right now? Do you want me to, rub your back? Is there something I can do for you? Like, well, the midwife really has her list there and she's supposed to check heart tones every so often. And you're supposed to be in a certain stage of labor after so many minutes, and you're supposed to get that placenta out after so many minutes. And so it's very hard. It puts midwives in a position where who are they going to answer to? Are they going to answer to the government, or are they going to answer to the woman? And there are many kind midwives out there that would love to answer to the woman, but they also know in the back of their mind that they could go to jail. And so that's, they're in a tough situation.
And
And
it's
then,
interesting, isn't it, how that the medical system will demonize midwives and anyone, in fact, who goes natural as something that's incredibly evil. And yet how many people die in hospitals, how many women die and babies die in hospital due to medical negligence and due to medical
oh,
interference.
absolutely.
And
I
yet
mean,
those
yeah,
cases are never brought to attention. And
right.
it's really essentially protecting the system. And I think a lot of this also comes down to money as well. It is a
Yeah,
big machine. Like here, I'm not sure in America, but they don't fund home birth at all here.
right.
It's all
Yeah,
private and out of pocket.
right.
But also they
Mhm.
make it they're making it more and more difficult for women to access any services whatsoever, on top of which the threat of, if you turn up to hospital, if you do need some help of any kind, we're going to, put child protection out on you, or we're going
Right.
to make your life a living hell. And I think it's
Mhm.
just very odd in this day when we as women have won women's rights, to our body, our choice, that when it comes to
Right.
pregnancy and when it comes to birth, we're somewhat in the dark ages. I mean,
Right.
have you have
Definitely.
you have you found that there's been any shift in that mentality towards that patient-centered care, that women should be able to decide the circumstances of their birth?
Um, well, let's see. I mean, my sixth grandchild was just born in the hospital, and they were actually a little bit less interventive than I was expecting.
Right.
Um, so, and so I think, and yet, if you look at the hospital statistics, I think that hospital probably has a 30% C-section rate. So,
Yep.
my daughter-in-law had a pretty straightforward labor, and so nobody came in and said, we're going to do a C-section. But I think it's if you go outside of that box, if you aren't giving birth within their time frame, then no matter how open they appear to be, they're going to slice you open. But I think, there's this idea that, like you said, that if you give birth in the hospital, that somehow you're doing what's right and you're doing what's safe. In American hospitals, a baby is stillborn every 20 to 30 minutes. So, and yet the myth continues that, if a baby dies at home, well, if you would have been in the hospital,
Yes.
the baby would have survived. And it's like, no, there's 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in miscarriage, and there are babies that, not all babies make it, and that's part of life. And there is no guarantee that if you're in the hospital, and like you said, that actually there are people that are saying, I think if I would have been at home, I might have been safer. Maybe my baby would have survived because this is what they did to me in the hospital. And certainly you have a much greater chance, you and your baby have a greater chance of dying during a C-section. And so with a I think it's 32 or 33% C-section rate in the US, then more mothers and babies are dying.
Yeah.
So we need to get rid of this idea that somehow it's safer there.
No, I mean, I don't think it is myself. I don't think it is safe. I had a high risk pregnancy and I deliberately chose. And I actually found I'd had multiple free births before this, but I had heart failure, and then I was going into another pregnancy. And of course, I had some interaction with the system then. And then I realized that if I wanted to have a home birth, that they wouldn't let me have it. Like they would want me to do an ultrasound every month. They would want me to be on
Yeah.
medication. And then they would use child protection to basically enforce their will upon me, and
Yeah.
then use my children against, like, my other younger children at that time. And they would
Right.
weaponize that and say, well, you're an irresponsible mother, you're putting them at risk. But I kind of knew that and I remember coming across your website, unassistedbirth.com, and for me, it just made sense what you were saying, that if you were well nourished, and what had happened in my previous pregnancy was that I wasn't well nourished. I'd moved house. I was under a great deal of stress. And things went completely pear-shaped. And I wasn't supported. So
Mhm.
then I thought, if I go back into the system, I thought my life is actually at great risk, because I'm going to experience all that trauma again. I'm going to be under a great deal of stress, because every time I interact with the medical system, my blood pressure is going to rise.
Right.
All those stress hormones are going to come in play. And this is even before the birth, this is all going to be throughout. And then I thought, oh, this is not going to be a great way to grow a baby and have a pregnancy. So I chose instead to go totally in the wild and have this amazing birth, well
Mm.
nourished. Every meal was, very well thought out. Nothing bad touched my lips. Literally, I was very
Yeah.
strict in that pregnancy, with exercise, with sleep, with rest, and all of that. And then I gave birth in 2 contractions in my bedroom.
Wow.
And the only reason
Wow.
I knew that I was giving birth was that it was a song that had come into my head. And I had this contraction about 3 in the morning. And the song was Your Wildest Dreams. And then I had
Wow.
this mat that I was going to make into a nappy covers at the time. And it was a woolen mat and I thought to myself, I'm just going to lay that mat out. And I'd read somewhere that they said that if you squat, that it increases your pelvis by, I think, 30% or something like that. And I just had this thought, I wonder what will happen if I just squat in on the next contraction and push. And of course I did that, and the baby just completely popped out. And
Wow.
so it really is quite profound when you know these things, and to piece together what is necessary to be done. But I feel that in our modern world, there's also other things that are at play. For example, nutrition. I feel like, in order to have a successful pregnancy these days, it's important to be on the nutritional side, that our world is becoming so much more toxic, and people just, the food that's actually available, you actually have to work hard to get good, nutritious food, like, whereas, say, when we were giving birth, in 30 years ago, 20 years ago, it was probably less so. I think that the doctors also, medical professionals, they don't really put an emphasis on what you've also said, well nourished. Like, you look back at, say, these these cultures, they weren't eating out of a supermarket.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So, there needs to be that, so where your book is a bit timeless in that respect, is the idea that of nourishment, in order to have all of the right things in place in order to have a beautiful pregnancy and an easy birth.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, the thing that I go into, because I don't really go into nutrition in my book, for me, when I do talk about food, it's just having food at all, that there are women, throughout history that have just not had enough food. And so that when you're starving to death, yes, your birth may be problematic, but your life is going to be problematic. And so that's something that some people have been critical of my book, because I basically talk about intuitive eating, and
Okay.
eating, kind of tuning in and asking yourself, what does my body need? What do I feel like eating? And getting more in touch with that. I don't really tell women this is what you should eat or shouldn't eat. I just kind of ate what felt right to me to eat.
But that is really essentially the same kind of thing in a way. When you tap into
Yeah.
that inner knowledge, because
Hmm.
otherwise you can write these kind of diet books and so forth, but what happens is what can be right for one woman may not be right for another woman.
Right,
And
right.
after
Hmm.
all, we have these things called cravings, and our
Yeah.
body sort of
Hmm.
allows us to know what we need to eat. And
Right.
you can
Hmm.
use that as a gauge. In fact, it becomes the whole pregnancy itself becomes this inner journey where, and what I've also found was that it becomes this rite of passage that, mothers, when they become disempowered by the medicalized system of birth, after they've had the baby, it's almost like the baby has been born inside a capsule or something, and someone's presented to them, here, this is your
Right.
baby. And then,
Hmm.
like, what shall we do with it? And then, oh, you've got to breastfeed it or whatever. And they don't have that inner knowing of how to raise that child because they haven't been able to trust themselves and it worked out
Right.
because that's
Yeah.
all the whole process, isn't it? Of being able to trust yourself and it works
Right.
out.
I mean, we're really taught from the very beginning to just turn ourselves over to the authorities. I think in a way, I had a little bit of a head start because my father was a doctor and I grew up in that whole medical system and it never felt right to me. It felt like here I looked at my father who was wonderful and a great man, but he and his friends, to me, they felt very arrogant. And I was like, something just hit me from the very beginning. Like, these are not gods. These are just human beings. And so people would come up to me and they'd tell me, your father is like this God. And I'm like, no, he's not. And so I never idolized or put doctors on a pedestal. I never was enamored. I was like, these people are they're arrogant and yes they've been to medical school and then getting the vaccines that would traumatize me as a child. And then I went to a pediatrician that was abusive and so in a way all of that sort of helped push me in this direction because I was like these people were not for me they were not my saviors. Now I understand that some people who I understand that the medical profession they can be wonderful and they can save lives, and modern medicine can be great, but and especially emergency medicine can
Yes.
be
Yes.
great, but in the birth world, I feel like we are going to look back on this time as a barbaric time that they're cutting open 33% of women when they give birth. Like this is not someday I do really trust that humanity will wake up and it's happening now. And they will see that no, for women to be told you can't trust your body, but you turn yourself over to us and we'll take over. Even women who will say I have a right, my body, my choice, but reproductive rights are not extended to the birth. You want to get an abortion, fine. And I am pro-choice, although I think it's not ideal. Obviously, I wish that women didn't have to go that route, but I'm glad that it's an option. But reproductive rights need to be extended to the birth of the baby, and then they need to be extended to our throughout our whole lives, so that it is our body, our choice. And like with the vaccines, I don't choose to vaccinate. I didn't choose to vaccinate my children. I didn't choose to get the COVID vaccine. And the people who are critical of me, they'll defend a woman's right to choose, but not her right to choose where she gives birth. Usually, unfortunately, it's liberals who tend to be more restrictive about home birth
Really?
than conservatives, which is puzzling to me. But
Oh.
but I have I have problems with both liberals and conservatives. But I think no, it's our bodies, and we should have the right to give birth the way we want. And so home birth legislation is often shot down by liberals, and so I'm just sort of
Odd, isn't it, that they would be opposed to
yeah,
it? They seem to be opposed now to homeschooling as well, which I think
right,
is
yeah,
very bizarre because I would have thought that the left was all into, freedom of choice
right,
after all. But
right,
it
yeah,
seems that it isn't what it. But One interesting thing that I got, I'll just read this now because I think it's a great segue here, is I got a message from Dr. Andy Kaufman, one of his newsletters, and it was just on home birth today. And I thought, wow, this is, really amazing that we're
Right.
having this interview this morning, and I got it. And it says, as a father of three and having been a supporter of home birth with my third and with help of natural healing, I've come to realize how important those elements are to a healthy family life and a successful birthing process, rather than leaving it up to the immoral medical system and its cold and ill-mannered obstetricians. So many of the ongoing birth problems that are largely becoming the norm are happening because we've been relying on an artificial system that we as humans are simply not designed for. By embracing natural home birth, you learn to step into your true role, take back your sovereignty completely, and steer clear of many obstacles brought forth by a system that was built to keep you down. The only thing that remains in the way of many is fear. And I just thought,
Wow.
wow. I mean,
Yes, that's what
isn't
I'm
this what
talking,
you've
like
been saying for like,
synchronicities, Yeah,
what you've
that's
been saying that for like 40 years almost, like
right.
it's amazing to see the shift that is actually happening now within I would say the awake freedom, space, that people firstly they questioned the what happened with the vaccines. And then they were
Yeah,
told, look, you can't have this number of people. I had a woman whose husband wasn't able to be at the birth because he wasn't vaccinated. So I just said to
right.
her, why don't you just have a home birth? And I was quite shocked that she was like, before I knew it, she was like researching. she,
Yeah,
she found a midwife. And then I actually said the another thing I actually told her to research, just one other thing, was fetal ejection reflex, which I think you could talk about. Um, and that was it. That was all she needed. And she sent me a picture of her baby. And that literally was the highlight of my year, to realize that, someone's life had been fundamentally changed. I think she recently had another baby at home. That the shift from that push, because her
right.
husband wasn't able to go there to the birth, to consider another option. And this is what I think a lot
Mhm.
of people have realized, is that do they really want to enter the medical system that was already so hostile to them about their freedom of choice over the vaccine? And they're still pushing the COVID-19 vaccine to pregnant women and a whole lot of other vaccines, plus having to guard their baby from vitamin K shot and
Right.
hepatitis B shot at birth when you're the most vulnerable. I mean, imagine you've got to
Yeah,
actually go to
right.
the hospital and have little guards on your
Yeah.
on your baby. I mean,
Yeah.
really, what sort of situation is that to give birth in? So a lot of people have made this shift. So what do you think of that? What do you just said that there?
What do I think? What?
Oh, what do you think of what Andy has said? How do you think like this is playing out? Like, obviously you agree with most of all of
Oh,
that, I assume.
yeah. Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think how COVID helped is that people are like, oh, okay, this is just going to be a short-term thing. Or then when it wasn't, then okay, now we're going to have this vaccine. And then when people were still getting it, still getting COVID, and then it made people question. And then when people were having reactions to the vaccine, it really did get people thinking, and feeling very controlled that they can't go where they want to go. They're having to put these masks on their faces, and it got
Entering
so
birth.
extreme. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so it got so ridiculous that I think it opened the eyes of people that maybe wouldn't have questioned the medical system. My current husband, would get his flu shot every year, and when COVID happened, he thought, well, he'd get the vaccine. He and I don't think alike on these things exactly. He does try to be more natural, but he's more into the medical system than I am. But then he decided to wait, and he was so glad he never did get vaccinated
Oh, fantastic.
against COVID. And he was so glad that he hadn't, because it eventually it just came out that there is so much misinformation. And then, people wanting to take something, this ivermectin or whatever, and then, that got demonized. Or people coming up with their own natural things, or just wanting to be with their friends and family and seeing that, this is not healthy. This is having a detrimental effect physically and psychologically. And so I think it got bad enough and people had time on their hands and they
To do the research.
started doing more research. And I've always been very optimistic, even though the C-section rate is still high. I do see more interest, certainly. I mean, when I started talking about this, like I didn't even know what to call what I was doing. I wrote to a publisher and I said, this is the way I had my children and I'm writing a book about it, which I wasn't. I was writing a book in my head. I had managed to get one magazine article published and they wrote back, this was an academic press. They wrote back and said, we're very interested in your book and please send us as much completed material as possible. So I was really surprised, but they published it. It's still in print. I eventually bought the paperback rights because I wanted to have, it was hardback and they did put out a paperback for a while, but so I eventually got the paperback rights and I self-published the paperback, but it's in libraries around thousands of libraries around the world. And I feel like more people are questioning and more people are giving birth this way. More people are giving birth at home and more people are challenging the system.
And I noticed that was that the article "Giving Birth the Old Way" on WebMD?
Oh no, that was somebody that interviewed me, and once again, like I said earlier, I kind of objected to that title because to me it's not an old way. I do think we have a much more a highly developed rational critical mind, and we're not. Some of these tribal cultures were giving birth successfully, but then, like I said, they were doing things to take the baby away from the mother. So maybe they were maybe intuitive when it came to the birth itself, but then they took the baby away from the mother and then they were having high infant and maternal mortality rates. So when people say, hey, this is the old way of giving birth, to me, it's sort of a new way because it's taking the intuition, as I said, but it's also, I'm not discounting the rational critical mind. We are meant to use our rational critical mind. It's there for a reason. We're not meant to get rid of our egos and the thinking part of ourselves. We're just meant to have both sides there. So that's why I look at this as sort of a new approach. We don't to fall victim to what some of these tribal women did or who were controlled by some of the people in the tribe and who didn't, women in some of these tribes weren't treated well. They were treated like second-class citizens. And so, but now women understand, no, I am not a second-class citizen. So we can have the benefits of the tribal knowledge, but we can also have the benefits of our highly evolved rational critical mind. So no, the article that I originally got published was in a publication that is no longer around, and it was just a small publication. But I sent that article to the publisher, and so I said, okay, here's the gist of what I'm saying, and the book will basically be an expansion of that. And they liked it, and they were supportive of it. And now, actually, it's Bloomsbury who owns my book, the Harry Potter people.
Oh, okay, really? Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Book.
I thought for some reason that and I guess in those days, the internet wasn't around, was it? When so much, 1994, it was very early days. So when you were a publisher, I mean, I think when people see your website, unassistedchildbirth.com, there's this sense that you're more of one of the modern, influencers, I guess, that comes along and has got a message. Whereas really you started off very much in the old ways, like it was an older time, pre-internet, essentially.
I mean, I wrote my book. I started my book on a notepad and I started handwriting it. And then I got a word processor. Like this was in the early 90s. And most people didn't even have computers. So then I put up my website probably in the late 90s, and there was nothing like it. There was nothing up there about unassisted birth. And so, and it used to be you'd Google unassisted childbirth or unassisted birth or free birth. I've also, freebirth.com will also get you there. But it used to be you Google those terms, my site popped up right at the top. That doesn't happen anymore.
Oh no, because they've censored you. That's why.
Right.
I had the same thing. I had my site was postpartum cardiomyopathy, PPCM. peripartum cardiomyopathy, and we'd be top, you know. And I think about, probably about 216 or somewhere around that time, they rejigged the whole algorithm and they decided to put a whole lot of weighting on medical sites, you know, and all of
Right.
the sites like ours that actually had the whole wealth and trove of information just sunk to the bottom of the,
Right.
you know, the pile, because they don't really want this information out there because it actually costs them money, you know,
Right. I
because
mean, childbirth is usually the number one or number two reason for hospital visits, along with like heart issues. And so, and I've told people our health system could turn around overnight if people realized that babies didn't need to be born in the hospital. I mean, it's, you know, but yeah. So then, what about all these people that are employed? You know,
well, it's not
that make
just
a
it's
living.
not just the fact that the savings from, they say, not having a C-section or all the complications from the actual birth itself, the traumatic birth that a woman may endure. It could be anything from, you know, surgical issues that she might need to have fixed, to because she's had to push when, you know, she hasn't, incontinence and all of those sort of things. But
Right.
also, you know, postpartum depression, suicide is one of the leading causes, but also they get the baby into the system from day one.
Right.
So I think even some very strong, you know, people just they go to birth and they go through the whole antenatal system, they have the baby, and then all of a sudden the baby is vaccinated. And this is all because there's no reason for hepatitis B even if you want to justify vaccines, the pediatricians have already said, you know, what's the reason? It's to train the parents. It's train the parents, but
Right.
also it causes brain inflammation. The parent has no knowledge that the baby of any difference to the baby's health, because if you take a baby from day one and vaccinate them, then how does the parent know what normal is anymore? What normal
Right.
behavior for that
Hmm.
baby is? And then that baby becomes a customer for life. They have to keep going back to more and more.
Right.
And they don't put the dots together. They don't realize that the eczema or the, you know, the autism, whatever it is, you know, health
Hmm.
issues, asthma is related to the vaccinations or
Right.
the fact of interacting with the medical system. And it can even be some things that the drugs that they give women during the birth, um, the actual things that are done during the birth, like ultrasound, you know, again, it's never been tested for safety. We accept it
Right.
as normal. So how do we
Hmm.
know all those things linking up are not leading to this epidemic of childhood illness and disease and chronic disease?
Right.
We
Yeah.
don't. The
Uh-huh.
metrics are there that the medical system has essentially failed women in terms of birth and failed children.
Right.
There has been no improvement for all the money that is spent. In fact, the more money that has been sent in the system, the worse outcomes there are. And yet at the same time, they're saying that we're the problem. We're the
Right.
misinformation.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
And yet we're
Yeah.
saying, hang on a minute, but do you even question these things? But it's very interesting though. I kind of had a quick look around at some of the medical, they seem to be a bit concerned because they're getting medical articles out there. This one was in 216's Women's Motivations for Having Unassisted Childbirth or High Risk Home Birth, an exploration of the literature of birthing outside the system. And there was another one, Unassisted Childbirth, Why Mothers Are Leaving the System. There's also, I also found an unassisted birth YouTube channel that had absolutely millions of views. So I think this shift is actually happening because people
Right.
are recognizing, look, the medical system is hitting rock bottom here because
Hmm.
they are pushing, I don't know, in the States, how many jabs during pregnancy, but when I was going through births, you know, most of my births within the system, it was never a thing. A pregnant woman literally had nothing. You know, you weren't allowed to jab a pregnant woman. I remember even after between my first and second child, they offered me a rubella vaccine. And they said to me, I wasn't allowed to get pregnant for 3 months, or the baby would be born deaf and blind, potentially.
Wow.
And I had to sign on
Wow.
the dotted line to agree to that. And I was like, oh my God, I don't know. Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Why are my antibodies low in the first place? Is it meant to be low? So anyway,
Yeah.
I decided that no, that was it for me. And I couldn't do it to myself. I was going to trust God and And then I
Yeah.
stopped my vaccinating my children, and I just made that decision. And then what happened was they couldn't figure out how I could have all these healthy children who'd never seen a doctor. It was
Right.
such a mystery
Right.
to them. But that's because that's when I realized that this whole birth, why it's such an important issue, why it's such an important right for women to have being able to birth on their terms at home and to be away from that medical system is because it restores birth to where it's meant to be, in the home, and restores
Right.
all our rights, and the connection of family. I mean, when you think about it with your children, how they feel about their siblings being born at home, it's such an amazing experience. Do you want to describe some of your births?
Yeah. Well, my first one, um, I went into labor with him well, it was like basically on my due date. It was hours before my due date. I knew exactly when I conceived him. Because I had a dream basically that I conceived, and it was so powerful. And I wrote it down, and then I said, okay, if I conceived then, when would my baby be born? And so I went into labor with him in the afternoon, and we had planned on we had talked about having a midwife at that birth. Um, but we thought, God, we're going to have to teach that midwife everything that we've been reading. I had read, because I had read Childbirth Without Fear, and then I had read Spiritual Midwifery by Ina May Gaskin, which was
Oh,
going in this direction. It's now I look at it as more interventive than I would like, but I would like the midwives to be further away, but there were a lot of great birth stories in that book, and I just read the birth stories over and over. I really didn't read about complications or anything. I just read the birth stories, and so we decided, if we have a midwife at the birth, we're going to have to teach her everything we've been reading. So my husband just said, let's just do it ourselves. So we decided to do it ourselves. So it was just, I went into labor with him. I was like walking home from the bookstore, and I was feeling contractions. And then we had a friend staying with us. And so he had said he wanted to be at the birth. And so I said, fine. And then my old boyfriend found this fascinating, and his new boyfriend.
oh my God.
And so they wanted to be at the birth. And then we had a filmmaker who was a professor at CU, University of Colorado, and he was making a film about us. And so he wanted to be there. So it was
Oh my goodness.
me and 5 men. So it was a very unusual birth. And people are like, oh, that's perverted. It's like, no, nobody was there to leer at me or anything. It was just these people that found this interesting,
Amazing.
what we were doing. And so,
And it was historic when you think about it, Laura,
yeah,
because,
yeah.
this birthed onto a book and the influence into so many people's other, journey. So what happened after that? So you gave birth
So
with all these men there, and you didn't feel
oh,
uncomfortable?
everybody's over, everybody's there, and everybody's smoking pot. This was 1978. Well, of course, now everybody's smoking pot anyhow. But and I wasn't smoking, but I decided to take one hit. And I was sitting on the toilet, and the people were like, people were in the bathroom with me. I took one hit and I breathed it in. And as I breathed it out, he started coming out. I reached down and I felt his face at my perineum. Well, and somebody said years later, oh, that was a face presentation. I was like, oh, yeah, I guess babies aren't supposed to be born face first. But so I reached down, I felt his face. I didn't say anything to anybody, like, I feel the baby here. And I walked over to the bed, and the filmmaker turned off the camera to let me go by. And I got on the bed and I was about to turn over, and I heard an inner voice say very distinctly, don't turn over. Because I had just seen, even in spiritual midwifery, they were giving birth on their backs. And
Yes.
but this voice was like very clear to me, don't turn over. And so I was on my hands and knees, and my husband was behind me, and he suddenly, the baby just came shooting out as I was on my hands and knees, and my husband caught him in midair. And the filmmaker stood there with the camera off, just like, oh,
Oh
because I hadn't said anything,
no. Oh
I didn't
yes.
say I was so within myself, so, and so, so we didn't have anything, we didn't document it, for years. Like nobody would, I'd tell people I had these easy births, and they're like,
Yes.
yeah, right. Now you can see a million births on YouTube, and
I know, isn't it?
there's so many great births on YouTube now, and so many unassisted births. But at the time, I think, people they just couldn't really conceive of this, and like, or
And
that
also it's a
some,
very private thing, isn't it? It's a very
yeah,
private, intimate process.
right,
And I
right,
think today it's become quite normal. Oh, did you get your birth photos? And I must say
yeah,
I have no birth photos. So it was the whole
yeah,
idea of having a birth, someone take photos of you while you're giving birth was just not something. We didn't have digital cameras as well, where everyone's just
right,
going to whip it out
right.
and um
I mean, it can be like another person there having, even if, if you set up a camera, the feeling of being observed. I tell people, people ask me, I'm like, yeah, do what feels right to you. I'm glad that there's a lot of good birth videos out there, but I can't tell you over the years how many times someone has said the camera died, someone stepped in front of the camera, something happened with the footage didn't turn out. I mean, over and over again. And it just seems like, yeah, maybe that just wasn't meant to be, so
yes.
out there. And so, but now, I mean, I've put up birth videos that people have sent me, and I think it's inspiring, because years ago, people were like, they just had no concept of what a natural birth was like. So many doctors have never even seen a natural birth. So, so for people to see it, I think it can be helpful. But so
And
his
then what you've
birth,
just described there is like it's called, is it fetal ejection
yeah,
reflex? That's
that
like
was
the
a
medical.
fetal ejection reflex, which Michel Odant, are you familiar with him?
No, no.
Michel Odant. Okay, he's a physician, but he has called himself a midwife, and he actually had a book published by this same publisher that and that's one of the things that led me to write to them, because I was like, oh, he's really leaning in this direction. But he says that that being observed, he's all about, no, a woman needs to go off to like another planet. And even if you tell a woman, like, okay, look in my eyes and, keep eye contact with me, like the birth coaches or whatever, it's like, no, let the woman go off to another
Yes.
planet. So, but he talks about the fetus ejection reflex. And he says, there is a reflex that will propel that baby from your body. If you aren't inhibiting it, it's the same reflex that sort of propels sperm. It'll shoot it from your body. But here again, stress inhibits all
Yeah,
sorts of
and
sexual functions.
it's interesting though, isn't it? Because when they teach us about birth, it's always like, how many centimeters is she dilated
Right,
and all of that.
right.
And I've never found that to myself. All of my births were just like that, where they just crowned literally,
Yeah,
one
yeah.
second, just like
I
a
never
like going to the
timed,
toilet.
I never timed contractions or measured dilation. I was like, this baby will come when it's ready,
And
so
and you had a breech birth as well, didn't you?
yeah. So my next birth was, I had a dream, and this is one of the things I talk about in my book, I write about, is that we have these inner resources, our intuition, our impulses, our dreams. And so I really worked with my dreams. I practiced giving birth in dreams. I'd suggest to myself that I practice. And in the beginning of my first pregnancy, I was dreaming that I was in a hospital. My father was there and other doctors. It was painful and difficult. By the end of the pregnancy, I was dreaming that I was giving birth at home, and it was very
Oh,
easy. So during my second pregnancy, I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to give birth on my hands and knees because that worked so well. But then I had a dream that I was watching a woman giving birth, and she was standing up over a little plastic baby bathtub, and she was catching the baby herself. And I heard a voice in the dream say, tell her to remember not to do too much, that it isn't a matter of pushing and panting and struggling and timing and, it's really a matter of understanding what it means to step aside and just let your body work. And so I really, in the dream, I'm like, oh, I get it. So I decided I was going to give birth standing over this little baby bathtub. So I went into labor with him one morning and about 7 in the morning. And uh, and I was feeling contractions, and then I decided to take a shower, and my water broke. And after my water broke, I didn't feel anything. I wasn't feeling contractions. I wasn't feeling pain. I wasn't feeling anything. I put my hand inside and I could feel my muscles going like this. So I knew I was having contractions, but I wasn't in pain. So but then I'm standing there and I took out my little bathtub because I thought, okay, well, I think this is going to happen pretty soon. And because my water broke, and with my first one, my water broke, and he was born right after. So that's why after my water broke with the second one, I was like, okay, I'm going to get out the bathtub, stand over it. And this foot came out. So I was not expecting a breech birth because I did not have prenatal care, or as some of us call it, prenatal scare. So now my friend, who had been one of the friends at the first birth, said he had a dream that he saw the baby standing up inside me, right side up.
Oh, wow.
But I still wasn't thinking I was going to have a breech birth. But this little foot came out as I'm standing there. Well, I'm not feeling the pressure from the head or the face, which I felt on the first birth. And so it's just this little foot, and he's just kind of going like this, like wiggling his toes, and my husband and my son are standing there, and my son, who's 2, he's like, what's that? And I said, that's the baby's foot. And my husband said, what should we do? Should we call an ambulance? And I'm thinking, if I go to the hospital right now, they're going to cut me open. Like, I knew somebody that was in a wheelchair because they started coming out feet first, and the doctor pushed them back in, and they were paralyzed for
Oh my
life.
goodness.
So I'm like, I'm not going to go in there. Like, I'm more afraid of the hospitals than I am of having a breech birth at home. So I just stood there and I did what the dream said, which is I did nothing to do. The dream said, do nothing to interfere. So I just stood there and did nothing. I said my belief suggestions, affirmations, because I'm a big believer in that. So I said, I believe I trust myself. I believe I have inner help. I believe I love myself. I'm letting my body work. I just said those things. And his foot got lower and lower. And then his other foot popped out. And this was all happening over the course of a couple minutes. And then something just said the time was right. And I gave one push pull and he came out.
Wow.
So 12 years later, and I asked my husband, when I was writing my book, I asked my husband about his Willie's birth, and he's like, I don't know, I wasn't there. I didn't know he wasn't there. He was in the other room.
Oh.
He and my son weren't even there. I was so within myself.
So,
Like, after he said that after he saw it was a foot, he was like, okay, he went in the other room, kind of trying to be calm. And then I remember him, then he came back in. I think he heard the baby cry and he came back in. And I remember hearing him say, you did it. So, but the other thing that I discovered is that Michel O'Donnell, this physician I was telling you about, I read in a book years later that he says that breech births can happen easily, but especially with footling. But there's 2 key things to keep in mind. Keep the woman in a standing, squat, or upright position and do absolutely nothing to interfere. So I felt like those were exactly the 2 messages of that dream that I had. Give birth standing up, and do not do anything. And so I feel like rather than having a dream that I was having a breech birth, which might have frightened me, my inner being, whatever, God, goddess, whatever you want to call it, that is there helping all of us, told me the messages that I needed to hear. And that birth was, painless and easy, and he just popped right out. And I remember then we went outside and I was sitting on the grass and just totally blissed out. And somebody walked by, this woman walked by, and she said, oh, how old is your baby? And I said, like a few hours old. And I told her what happened. And she's like, this changed my life. She's like, I'm going to have my babies at home. And I ran into her a few years later, and she had with her 2 home birth babies. So I think when people, they hear about it, and so, but it
It is
was,
inspiring. It is, because there's two things that they will say against you for having a home birth is, what if it's a breech and what if
yeah.
it's twins? Now, it's an interesting
Ah,
one. Recently, a woman that we buy tooth products from, she's in the States, and she didn't know she was having twins, but she was going to just have an ultrasound just to check. But every time she had booked this ultrasound, it just, something came up and she never got the ultrasound. So she never found
yeah,
out. She had the first baby, and then she thought, 10 minutes later, the placenta was coming out, but it turned out to be another baby.
yeah,
And I was just thinking how profound that was, that you just know what you need to know sometimes, that how stressful
right,
her whole journey of pregnancy might have been had she known that she was having twins. But obviously she didn't need to know. Like, that was
right,
the universe said,
right,
she didn't glitch, that she didn't tweak that she was having
yeah,
twins at all.
right,
So
right,
when you hear these really powerful stories like yours and hers, and mine and other women's, it builds up an a an understanding about birth, doesn't it? Like, what we've been poisoned with within the media is, you know, my goodness, the woman's having birth, emergency, get the ambulance,
right,
go to
right,
hospital. And so we've lost touch with that narrative. And I think this is where we're reclaiming it by telling people these stories of what birth is like. And the birth is all different too. Some labors are longer, some are shorter, you know, different situations and all. But ultimately, it's the woman's trust in her innate ability to give birth
right,
that is
right.
is so incredibly
Mhm.
powerful, that what you've done. I read that breech birth story and thought, well, if Laura can give birth breech, then what's there to fear? Because if you can give birth, and recently, and I think another woman that I knew had a breech birth, and they just knew instantly. All that they had to remember was, don't touch the baby,
Yeah,
just let it, just don't do anything. And again,
right.
that was just the one thing that stuck in their minds from, I guess, watching so many podcasts and videos and hearing so
Hmm.
many stories. Because isn't this how in ancient cultures, we passed on knowledge? We passed on
Right.
knowledge through storytelling. So you telling your
Uh-huh.
story is incredibly powerful to so many people, because they realize that it's when you add all these stories together, and even just the one story standalone, it's like, okay, it's not a medical emergency.
Right, right. I think it was Janine Parvati Baker who coined the term free birth, which a lot of people call unassisted birth, free birth now.
Okay, yep.
Um, and she said, birth is not an emergency; it's simply an emergence. You know, and
Yes.
so,
Oh my goodness. There's so many
so
amazing things that,
yeah.
what was it? What you call it? Anti-scare, or
Oh, prenatal scare. Yeah.
prenatal scare.
And
And again, a lot of those medical tests, what they're doing and they're designed to do, and people don't realize, is they're designed to get you into the system and to get you
right,
to comply to various other things. Like, they do a lot of things that are totally unnecessary. What's the one for Down syndrome, for example, and then 1 in 200 who do have this other test afterwards end up miscarrying. You think, oh, what's, what's the point exactly? What's the
yeah,
what's the point of having a medical
right,
test that is so dangerous, that really is there led to have more and more intervention? And when you actually think about it, the whole
right,
system is designed to set you up for failure. And then, of course,
right,
it's
right,
your fault. It's the
right,
woman's fault
right.
that she
Uh-huh.
failed, even though the
Right,
system itself has been rigged against her to fail, because she hasn't been given the knowledge and empowerment in order to give birth naturally, painlessly, joyously,
right.
which gets into
Yeah.
another topic. I think I saw you recently say, even orgasmically, that it's all very attached to sexuality.
Right, definitely. I mean, it's simply the completion of the sex act. It's like it's the same hormones, it's the same organs, and so why should it? I did a radio interview once, and I started talking about that and connecting sex with birth, and the host was like, "This is ridiculous. Like, what does one have to do with the other?" I'm like, "How can you say that? Of course, it's involving the same hormones and organs, and it's the completion of the sex act. I mean, not that all sex acts have to end in birth, but why should it be so far? You have this potentially ecstatic experience, and then you have the birth that's the other end of the spectrum. Why? And so there are women. I started writing about this. I had read, because Ina May Gaskin talked about that a little bit, and then I got really fascinated with the whole idea of that there are women who spontaneously have orgasms during birth, and there's ones that create them, as that it helps to get the
Baby up.
hormones flowing,
Yep.
to get the oxytocin flowing. I mean, the oxytocin flows when you're having sex, and it should be flowing when you're giving birth. And so being sexually stimulated can help you give birth. So I have a whole sensual section on my site of orgasmic birth, sensual birth, that it's meant to be a pleasurable experience. And I'm not saying we don't have some pain, but we can have some pleasure too. And the more we look at it as part of our sex life, the better it will be. If we could approach it in that spirit of fun, and this is something that is pleasurable, and this is something that connects us potentially to our partners and to our babies. And why is it more acceptable to say I screamed in pain when I gave birth than it is to say I screamed with pleasure as I gave birth?
Yes.
Like, no, we can't say that. That's perverted. It's okay if you have that pain, but not that
And even
pleasure.
like breastfeeding, right? Breastfeeding has become this issue, not issue, but it's these sexualized organs that are being, flashed out in front of the public. And
Yeah, right.
that women have become, I mean, it's crazy when you really think about it. I think about what you're actually saying. It's very interesting, isn't it? That if you have a pleasurable birth, where all those hormones are flowing, it actually aids in bonding with the baby. And that
Right.
whole imprinting and whatever is being produced in your body is also then transferred through the breast milk. And perhaps even this is
Right.
why there's such a high failure rate with breastfeeding. Perhaps it's the whole birth process has been so traumatic that, again, the blood supply isn't flowing in the right way that it
Right.
should be.
Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
therefore, perhaps, the milk isn't coming in, and all of
Yeah.
the hormones aren't being activated.
Right.
That
And
if
I
we
think
get,
our inhibitions, our sexual shame, that affects our ability to breastfeed. If, women are like, oh, but then I go out in public and I don't want to breastfeed in public. And so it's just easier if I have a bottle. And, it's, yeah. So I write a lot about fear, shame, and guilt, and how those emotions affect our bodies. And I do think they affect birth, and they affect breastfeeding.
yeah, I mean, it's amazing the whole life cycle of all of that. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Laura, to our show today? I think we've covered quite a lot of things in it. I
One
know
thing
you've got,
oh, go
yep.
ahead.
No.
Uh, I forgot to say that I had sex and labor with the breech birth.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and
So that was
so,
to just simulate everything from.
no, it just was because we just wanted to.
Oh,
We
yes. I
hadn't
guess
read
that is
anything
that's
about it.
interesting. It is. I mean, like, it's one of those things that we're not a lot of openly talk about, isn't it? It's like motherhood is almost seen like the Madonna, the virgin birth.
Right.
Yeah, like
Right.
that when you think about even the whole concept of marriage, of what society has put on women, women still
Hmm.
dressed in white dresses, symbolic of purity, and
Right.
um,
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
that, and that everything has to be sort of, and when you think about hospitals, it's all got to be sterile and separate. Like birth
Right.
is completely
Yeah.
separate from
Uh-huh.
sex and
Yeah.
love and intimacy,
Right.
where it's
Right.
all this whole spectrum of interconnectedness, and
Hmm.
where the baby at the end is just the essentially a reward for the love that two people shared
Yeah.
to create. But we don't
Right.
even, I think society doesn't even see that connection. I mean, when you think about how children and teenagers are taught about sexuality these days, and babies, there's this real
Mhm.
disconnect. It's almost like babies are this product of a physical reaction. Almost a
Right.
physical,
Right.
chemical, but it doesn't have
Yeah.
to do with love. And sex doesn't have
Right.
to do with
Right.
love and intimacy.
Yeah.
But if you actually put
Yeah.
the whole spectrum together, sex, intimacy, um, pregnancy, childbirth, it all runs
Mhm.
across this whole thing that actually adds to the society, and you actually connect it together, strong families, strong relationships.
Right. Right.
Um, and then less government control because we're
Right.
all now connected to each other on a very intimate spiritual level. And I
Hmm.
just absolutely love the fact that you've shared all these dreams to it because I think your dreams really get activated during pregnancy. I know that
Right.
myself too, that
Yeah.
you
And
feel like a
it's
different person, right? Like it's almost like you had some sort of superpower. And how often
yeah.
is that celebrated? Do they ever say to
Right.
young girls, say when you have a baby, it's like a superpower. You're
Oh,
going to
yeah.
feel incredible. No, no, no. They
Yeah.
talk about all these other things, pain during childbirth, you know, morning sickness, all the things that
Yeah.
could possibly go wrong and how you could die and,
Right. Yeah.
but they
Yeah.
don't say
It's
to a
presented
young
in.
woman, this
Hmm?
is going to be the most amazing thing that you will ever do.
I mean, I was never the same. Here I am, my oldest is 46. I'm still talking about it because it was such a life-changing experience. And all of my births were just so wonderful. And I loved it. I've heard women who've had, when you have a good experience in birth, I've heard women say, I don't know if I want more children, but I want to give birth again. Like that was such a thrilling experience. Certainly it was the highlights of my lives as is the births of my children.
Yeah. It was actually sad when I was not having any more babies. I was like, oh, you sort of felt that you could continue this sort of giving birth for almost indefinitely, but then you get to a certain age, and then I guess almost dying a few times, I kind of had to reconsider.
Ah, yeah,
That after,
yeah,
11, it was like, okay. So, I mean, it must be amazing
wow.
having the grandchildren now to complete that
Right. Yeah.
cycle, essentially watching your own children. Did any of your babies have um free births or did they follow in
No,
your footsteps? No.
no. My one daughter had her son in a birth center in a hospital, and they pretty much left her alone. She gave birth in the water, and some woman in jeans came in towards the very end, and someone said, "Oh, she's the midwife." But they really left her alone, so that was nice. Now, my other daughter had two home births. Um, and she had non-interventive midwives. And with her second one, she called me, and it was like 11:30 in the morning, and she said she wanted me to come take the 2-year-old, or that, and so I said, okay, I'll come up, and she said, I'm pretty sure that this is it. I'm pretty sure I'm in labor, and I got a call less than a half an hour later, baby's here. Like the midwife. So, like from the time she thought, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is it, and then the midwife came a few minutes later, and the baby came, and Joy said, I could have done it. I could have done it unassisted. So,
Yeah.
but
Another
we're
try.
with spouses, I mean, for
Yes, I
her,
guess that's
just to get
true.
her husband on board with the home birth, that was, an accomplishment, and they're so glad that they did. And then my other kids, my other grandkids were born in the hospital, but so far no C-sections. So I've got,
And I think
six.
one last thing I was going to touch on, I think I saw in one of your um, podcasts something about lactating. That
Oh,
you can induce lactating in someone that hasn't given birth, or
oh, yeah. I mean, basically anybody can produce breast milk. I mean, males and females. And it used to be that grandmothers in the tribes would just relactate, and they'd help with the breastfeeding.
and do you have to
Um,
actually suckle? Like, do they have to suckle in
well,
order to do
I
that?
wrote about this in my book, which is another reason why some people will say I'm a nutcase, but we had read that men were biologically, they have mammary glands. And so and I'm sorry for the people behind me. I'm in a hotel lobby because the internet is down in my room. So,
Right.
so people are walking behind me, but So we had read that there were men throughout history who had produced breast milk. Sometimes, like if a woman died in childbirth, that the man would take over. And in most of these cases, and I ended up writing an article about it called "Milkmen, Fathers Who Breastfeed." In most cases, a man put the baby to his breast, and if anybody stimulates by a breast pump or by actually nursing, they will eventually produce milk. But we thought this was interesting, and we were very into belief suggestion. So David decided he didn't actually want to nurse our children, but he wanted to see if he could lactate through suggestion.
Okay.
So he suggested to himself that he would lactate. And within a few weeks, he was sitting there reading a book one day and he felt something wet on his shirt. And he looked down and milk was dripping out.
Oh,
Now, we
wow.
showed my father, a physician, and my father said something is physiologically wrong with him. And so then David told himself it would go away, and it did. And then I
Yeah.
started researching it, and I found that I knew a friend who had who was friends with a gay couple and who was adopting a baby. And one of the men began using a breast pump during the pregnancy. And so that by the time that the baby was born, he had a full milk supply. And there's a man named Jared Diamond who has written about this. He's a scientist, and it's in a chapter in one of his books. And he sees this as maybe a way of the future that men will be more involved. But in his case, he talks about men taking hormones and stuff. And I'm not really
Yeah.
a fan of that. And I also, the men who have done this, the breast doesn't return to normal. So after breastfeeding a child for a long time, in some men, it never returns to normal. So there are men who have done it simply, without any drugs at all, just by using a breast pump or actually nursing a baby. Of course, then you run into, social services thinking this is
Yes. Yeah.
you're an abusive parent. In our case, we just thought it was an interesting phenomenon. And women who have adopted babies can nurse them also and a lot of these women will use breast pumps before the baby comes, and so that when they do get the baby, they can nurse them. So it's an interesting phenomenon.
I mean, you're really on the cutting edge, aren't you, Laura? You just want to be there. Even like, unassisted birth is just becoming a little bit more mainstream now. We need to take it a new level with this, with this
Yeah.
other things. I mean, I see my husband said to me today, "Oh, you're not so radical anymore because most of the people, unassisted birth is becoming so common." And I thought,
Yeah,
oh, but
that's
really
fine.
it is a very interesting thing, isn't it? It opens up your mind to new possibilities of what it is to be human,
Right,
like, and a lot of these left-right arguments are really shutting people's down in terms of um, really embracing the diversity of life and the living experience that what you've
right.
shared with us today is just, it takes a lot of bravery to do it because when you're on the cutting edge, I think people will just call you crazy or a nutter. But then,
Yeah,
30, 40 years time will just be like, oh yeah, that's pretty normal, right?
right.
And people
I
will go back and
right.
they'll look back but in order to get to that 30, 40 years time, people do have to do what you do in that they have to be at the cutting edge and be that like little
Right,
experiment almost. You were that experiment where you were
right.
standing there in front of all these men. And I find it really fascinating that men were so involved and just wanting to know the birth process in terms of from
Yeah.
a very analytical point of view to piece it together for themselves, that it
Men
wasn't.
have been, I'd say I've had much actually nicer responses from men a lot of the time. Maybe because women, especially if they've given birth, then they feel that maybe I'm, like putting them down, which I'm not. But,
Yes.
or if I say, well, maybe it didn't have to be as painful as it was, or I always have to choose my words carefully, but men are kind of like, huh, yeah, that makes sense,
I think that's
maybe
because they're not
people.
as emotionally connected to it.
Right,
That
right.
I myself the same thing. Like I've never pushed my ideas on anyone. It's whatever
Right.
birth you want to have is
Yeah.
your birth because it's whatever
Right.
your journey is at. But I love the fact that these men want to piece together the pieces in terms of how it all
Yeah.
works. Because when you
Uh-huh.
understand how it all works and it makes sense to you, then you can kind of start dismantling some of the false belief systems, and then it actually changes how you give birth. It actually has that, shift.
Right. Right.
There's both the shift of the mental and the intuitive, because we can know
Uh-huh.
intuitively how things work, but until we kind of solidify that in terms of the the the, the analytical space, it kind of
Yeah.
doesn't cement as well. And like, I think that's, if you can justify both positions and have them together, it's a very strong place to go from. And I hope
Right.
that, lots of people will enjoy this and be inspired by it, because taking back birth is actually taking back one's health and the health of future
Right.
generations.
Absolutely. I mean, and ideally it should be an ecstatic experience, even if there is some pain. But I think, the one thing I've always said is that the hardest part to me of having an unassisted birth is dealing with friends, family, and a society that thinks you're crazy. The birth itself, once you really understand and learn to cooperate with your body and trust your body, the birth itself can be so easy. It's just having the courage to do this in a society that at this point is not really that supportive of it. And so I think, that's where, then it develops something in you that will serve you as a parent and serve you as a person for the rest of your life. If you say, you know what, I don't need their permission, I don't need their approval. This feels right to me. And so I'm going to do it. And, my parents, my dad is gone now, but my mom, when my daughter was giving birth at home, she's like, oh, Joy really shouldn't do that. Like, if you wait for people to approve of you, if you wait until, society approves of you or your family approves of you, if you try to convince everybody, no, I mean, it's kind of a solitary thing. You've got to be willing to walk this path and say, you know what, I do have a lot of support. It's just out there in the world. There are a lot of people doing this. There are people that understand. And I have inner help. I've never felt like I was, even when I've given birth by myself, my third child, my daughter, I was by myself. I never felt alone because I always felt that internal presence, that internal guidance. So I think, when people say, oh, it's an unassisted birth and nobody's there, isn't that scary? No, it's, I believed in myself and I believed in some sort of larger consciousness that grew that baby from an egg and a sperm into a human being. It was right there with me. I never felt alone.
And then
And
now we actually have even more than what we had before pre-internet days. And that
yeah,
was because, now people have social media. There's so many
right.
free birthing groups. There's so many forums. You can reach out to
Yeah,
grab
yeah,
your
there's
book.
lots of support for
There's
people
so
out
many
there.
resources available to people that even if they don't have support within their own circle, there is a
Right.
wider network of support. And I think that's what people found during the pandemic, was that
Hmm.
even though they felt alone and discriminated and ostracized, that there were people online that they were able to reach out to, befriend, even meet in real life, that were
Right.
able to
Uh-huh.
help them grow as people and
Yeah.
to find solutions when there didn't seem to be any, when it seemed like everything was against them. So,
Right. Right.
so your website is unassistedchildbirth.com. For some reason I thought it was
Yeah.
unassisted, and it's unassistedbirth as well.com.
It's unassistedchildbirth.com, unassistedbirth.com, freebirth.com. Those will all get you there.
Yeah. And your book's available on Amazon, Booktopia. You're on Facebook as
Yeah.
Laura Shanley, and you've got an unassisted birth page on Facebook as well, or?
Yeah, I do. I haven't been that active in that, but yeah, I think it's facebook.com/unassisted childbirth. Then my personal page is facebook.com/Laura Shanley. And there's there's lots of groups online and, other unassisted birth pages and stuff. Mine, I'm just not as active, in online as I once was. I still, I love doing interviews. That's kind of my thing. I
Yes.
really enjoy that. So I still, I do interviews and podcasts and occasionally, media. There's waves of media attention over the years, and the media has actually been pretty kind to me. So
As they should be,
yeah,
because
yeah,
you are an extraordinary woman, because you have, I feel that in this space of women's rights, and it's been something that we've had to fight for, and we're continuing to fight for. In Australia, they are continuing to demonize and make it difficult for women just to even have a home birth with a midwife.
Right.
Various legislations, various things are coming into play that are going to make it very difficult. They're taking away our freedom to choose and our
Mhm.
autonomy, which all goes into play with pushing us into the medical system and medicalized birth, which is traumatic birth, which goes into play with, the future generations, where we as mothers have that innate sense of protection of our young.
Right.
And that's
Right.
where birth is at, where when you're saying about going into a place and giving birth alone, or, like retreating and being in that headspace in your own space, it's very primordial,
Hmm.
it's very instinctive. We know how to protect our young because we're not giving birth in the presence of strangers and who we don't know, who
Right.
we don't trust. We're in
Hmm.
a safe environment, and this is where I feel that there's become a fracture in society where there's no even middle ground anymore. I mean, it's fortunate that your girls have found that in America, but in Australia in particular at the moment, there really isn't. It's almost at two extreme. There's two extreme ends of
Mm.
it. A
Right.
very highly medicalized system that I've even heard someone say that they were offered what was it? An elective C-section because her obstetrician told her that C-sections were, I think, was it safer than a vaginal birth, even though she'd
Right. I've
never.
heard, I've heard people say that. Yeah.
And I think the other thing that they really discouraged, but we didn't really touch on, was VBACs, that this is one of the reasons that they give that a woman can't have a home birth or a natural birth afterwards is if she's had one cesarean,
Right.
somehow the uterus is now compromised and the whole system
Right.
is, and therefore she
Well,
needs to be cut open again.
what's interesting is that the term VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean, was coined by Nancy Weiner Cohen. Now she goes by Nancy Weiner. And she wrote a couple of books called Silent Knife and Open Season, and just all about the cesarean epidemic. I hadn't heard from Nancy in years. Yesterday, she texted me to say hello.
Oh, lovely.
And so I might as well give her a plug because she coined that term. And, of course, she thought when she wrote years ago, okay, let's turn this around. And now, it was disheartening to her that the C-section rate went up. But there are people that are having VBACs, and she says it's safer. You don't want to keep cutting into a woman.
So, I mean,
It's
in your insights with this, what do you think is the answer of how we will turn this around?
I think it's just individual women tapping into their own power and giving birth this way, and then just sharing it. I've never been into proselytizing. I never felt like I wanted to, I have to go out there and scream this from the rooftops. I definitely wanted to get my message out there. I mean, I wanted to when the internet came along, I felt this compulsion. I'm like, I've got to put up a website. I have to put up these stories. But I never pushed it, I never pushed it. I just felt like, and people found it. And then, and I never pushed the media stuff. But people, the people in the media found it. And then there would be like kind of these waves of media because somebody would see it and somebody else would see that program or whatever. Now there isn't, I don't get much of I did 2020 in the US, and I've done Good Morning America. I think I did different shows over the years, but mainly just because people would approach me. So I don't feel like we have to go out there and tell people you've got to give birth this way. But it's just, I just kind of always trusted that, okay, you put up a website, you put up and you share your story. And I remember being nervous before an interview once, and my husband said to me, all you got to do is share your story. It's like, you don't have to shove this down people's throats. It's like, share your story. This stuff just makes sense. And so when people hear it, it's like, if they're at all open-minded and they're at all willing to challenge the system, then, this is getting out there. So I never tried to do anything with any legislation or I never went like approached the medical community and or I never tried to demonize them either. I never said, doctors are horrible. I'm just like, yeah, most of them are well-meaning people that think they're doing a good job. And most of them in the birth world are misguided. And I think, there are midwives who are, and Nancy, who coined the term VBAC, she became a midwife. She felt like, okay, then this is how she could help people, but some women who feel like, yes, I want to help women do this. And then they become a midwife and then they realize, uh-oh, now I have these rules I have to follow, unless they're willing to be an underground midwife. But I think just, believing that there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And I've always just felt like, okay, one of these days it's, our time will come. But it's been, I think it's a slow process for society to turn around and for women to start trusting themselves and believing in themselves. But little by little it's happening. And I just feel like, so I continue to share my story with anybody that asks. And I think other women who've experienced this are sharing their stories, and little by little, the world is changing.
Yeah, truly, it's beautiful. I think that you're right there. It's not so much a battle, it's more building bridges to what
Right.
people's own understanding. And I think this is where,
Absolutely.
even with the whole left or right to fight, nothing really gets achieved by fighting. Where
Yeah.
where it's
Right.
achieved through is by storytelling, by connecting, by
Hmm.
sharing each other's shared journey and experiences. And then
Right.
there's these various little shifts and also a non-judgmental attitude, whereas often when someone takes a particular position on something, for example, men can't breastfeed, let's say, for example, that, then it becomes very polarized that no one can
Yeah.
actually look any further because you become, oh, you're one of those people.
Yeah.
As we sort of experienced during the pandemic, that it become an us and them kind of thing, and then everyone just completely shut down to any sort of conversation with each other. And I think the birthing space
Yeah.
has become a bit that way because there has been these battle lines drawn, and I've watched it go backwards in a way. I feel as
Yeah.
though the more lines have been drawn, the more intense the battle has become.
Hmm.
Because when I gave
Right.
birth initially, first time was 33 years ago, and I've got my medical records from my first five, which sort of in the system. Two of those were born at home, two were in a birth center, but I remember handing it to a nurse of 30 something years, she's retired. I think she was 40-year-old nurse. And she looked at them and she said, "Oh, wow, there's hardly any intervention in any of this. There was no ultrasound, hardly any tests, hardly anything there." And I thought, oh, it is interesting because nowadays, they make people submit to a birth plan. There's all sorts of rules.
Right.
You've got to make
Yeah.
these appointments. If you don't make this appointment, that they even, send child protection out on some people if they suspect that they might be non-compliant. And I thought, gee, how far have we become that women have become, it's like you give a little bit. They haven't fought, I guess maybe because you're out in the 70s, we're sort of an older generation. We've had to fight a little bit more. Maybe the younger generation haven't had to fight as much. Therefore, they become more compliant. The more you have a compliant population, which is used to being bossed over, then
Yeah.
the bossy medical system will just say, oh, well, you let us take this. You let us
Yeah.
have, you let
Right.
us introduce one jab, which was the flu jab, which was, I think, around
Yeah.
15. Okay, now we're going to introduce another one and we're going to put the COVID vaccine on top, you know.
Yeah.
So, because they'll do whatever they can get away with. And even hepatitis B,
Yeah.
I think that came out probably around the same time, about 2016, around that time. You let us have the vitamin K injection. Well, we're going to move forward with giving you hepatitis B. We're going to add more to the
Right.
schedule and all of that sort of thing. Is that we as women, it's, I guess you just have to walk away from it in a way and just do your own thing
Right.
and hope that other people will do the same because the battle lines don't seem to be making things better at all.
Yeah. Right. Right. And I think, I tell people when people are afraid of the system, and I tell people, don't underestimate. I once had a dream that said, never underestimate the power of a loving thought, and self-love and self-approval. is so important. And I think, and it will serve you not only in your birth, but in dealing with the system. Like, people are afraid to go against the system because they feel like the system is so powerful. And what I'm saying is there is something within you that is even more powerful. And we don't have to be afraid that, that there is this government out there that's going to control us and it's going to take away all our rights. I don't think we should close our eyes to what's going on, but I do think we should open our eyes to, there is a power within us, and if we don't have to fear that they're going to take away our babies, that they're going to force us to do this. There's something within us that if we believe in that, we can prevail, and we can be free.
Yeah.
There is more power within us than we realize, and keep believing that. And
Okay.
you can deal with a system that maybe doesn't support you or understand you.
Yeah, and we can be the trailblazers. And I think that's part of people's story, that they can see themselves as trailblazers, that they are at the forefront of something huge and wonderful. And ultimately, I think we've sort of covered all of the benefits of it too. Like, I think what happens is they get us stuck into this narrative of risk, which is where we've had to be. And I said at the start, before we started this interview, that it was going to be different in terms of most of the times when you're talking about something like unassisted birth or vaccination, it's often from a position of defense, defending our position. Where
Right.
here we're actually saying, well, look, these are the benefits. These are the real benefits of having a birth, an unassisted birth in particular. You've got you're not stressed. Everything flows well. You've got all those oxytocin hormones. It's a loving, wonderful situation to bring a child in. That is like, if you can imagine your dream birth. I think if you said to any woman, imagine your dream birth, I don't think she would imagine it in a hospital.
Right. And I taught a class once, and it wasn't a class on unassisted birth. It was just about like overcoming your fear and trusting your body. And it wasn't really specifying where the baby was born. But I asked women, okay, well, imagine your ideal birth. And all of them, it was unassisted. And a lot of them, it was outside, so yeah, it's sort of natural if you, well, it is very natural. It is the
Imagine
most.
if they said to us, if they said to them, imagine, instead of having a birth plan, they came to the
Yeah.
first entry point and then they said, now I want you to visualize your dream birth, who you want there, how you want to go, and then tell us and write that down and go home and dream it and make it a
Right.
reality. How different would that be? And even like, how do you want to be cared for after, before?
Right.
And
Right.
women of us can firstly envisage it and then really make it a reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. Visualization. These are the inner tools we have: visualization, affirmations, dreams, impulses. I talk about the psychological lifeline to the inner self. These are the things that connect us to our inner self. We have these natural resources we can tap into. We don't have to go to the authorities. We have that inner voice. We have that inner guidance.
Anyway, thank you so much for your time today, Laura.
Yeah, thank
As
you.
I
It was
said, you can be
wonderful
found at
talking to you.
Unassisted, hang around for a second after, Childbirth, and on Facebook, your book Unassisted Childbirth is available online. We'll post all of these things in the description, our website, healthallianceaustralia.org. Come back, check out our videos. Thanks everyone for watching. Thank you, Laura, for your time today.
Thank you.